Good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan, and welcome to the Forum, where each week we examine important issues at the intersection of faith and the modern world. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here at St. Bart's, and I am extra delighted this morning to welcome my newest clergy colleague, the Reverend Meredith Ward, who has been Interim Associate Rector here since the beginning of June. This morning, she will be talking about Mary Magdalene and artistic representations of her as we approach Mary Magdalene's feast day this coming Thursday, July 22nd. And Meredith is especially qualified to speak about the intersection of art and faith. She owns, in addition to serving here at St. Bart's, she owns and operates her own art gallery on the Upper East Side, Meredith Ward Fine Art, and she holds degrees in art history. Meredith, it's such a privilege to have you with us this morning, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Peter. Thank you for this invitation to present the forum this morning. I'm going to go ahead before I get started and share my screen because we've got some great images to look at here. Okay. So, as Peter mentioned, the idea for this forum came because we're in the middle of summer, and July 22nd is the feast day of Mary Magdalene. And, you know, there's probably no other biblical character who's more misunderstood or misinterpreted than Mary Magdalene. She was one of the inner circle of followers of Jesus. And she's been portrayed in many different ways as a penitent sinner, a prostitute, the first witness to the resurrection, and the apostle to the apostles. Throughout the centuries, the church has projected upon her both the transcendent hope of Christian redemption, as well as its fears and anxieties about gender and sexuality. This morning, we're going to explore Mary Magdalene's story through art and scripture and see how early interpretations of her have shaped our current understanding. We'll focus particularly on depictions of the account that is unique to John's gospel, Mary Magdalene's encounter with the risen Christ on Easter morning, when Jesus instructs her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father." Known by the Latin phrase "noli me tangere," or "do not touch me," depictions of that scene flourished as objects of personal devotion beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries. The story also has particular resonance for us now as we emerge from the pandemic and over a year of social distancing. We've been deprived of ordinary physical contact with each other. We've had to stay physically away from church, and we've gone without the Eucharist, the taste and touch and smell of the bread and wine that is so integral to our faith. So as we spend some time at the intersection of scripture, image, and our own experiences, I hope that we might expand our understanding of Mary Magdalene's role as the first witness to the resurrection and what her faithful witness may mean for us today. And also keep in mind that question of how this story of Mary and Jesus informs our own experiences over this past year. So before we jump in, I'd like to share a story with you. Many years ago, when I was just beginning my own spiritual journey, I began to realize that my relationship with God had kind of gotten stuck. And the stuckness, I discovered, had to do with Jesus. With our Trinitarian God, I was okay with God and the Holy Spirit, mostly because they were kind of abstract and mysterious. But Jesus I had trouble with. And my trouble arose from his humanness. His word became fleshness. For some reason, the same physicality that made him essential to my faith was also kind of keeping me at a distance. Jesus, both divine and human, breaks down barriers and invites a level of intimacy with God on our own human terms. And I think back then, I wasn't quite ready. So as I was wrestling with these thoughts, I came across this image depicting that scene from John's Gospel. You can see the open tomb on the left with the two angels sitting atop it. The soldiers posted to guard the tomb have fallen asleep. That is a detail that's actually not in John's version, but it's an addition from Matthew's Gospel. The risen Christ is at the far right, the wounds visible on his hand and foot. And Mary Magdalene is at center, on her knees and reaching out to him with a dramatic and spontaneous gesture. She's just recognized Jesus, and in her shock and joy, she reaches out to touch him. This image, and particularly Mary's urgent gesture, seemed to encapsulate my own spiritual state, a profound sense of yearning for Christ, who appeared so close and yet was just out of reach. I spent a lot of time with this image. I even set it as my screensaver on my computer. It gave me comfort, but it also raised a lot of questions like, why did Jesus tell Mary not to touch him? What's going on with those scraggy trees in this otherwise barren landscape? And why is Mary on her knees instead of standing, as it says in the text? So let's take a look at the actual text that this painting depicts. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned round and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. So Mary Magdalene's encounter with the risen Christ on Easter morning is an action-packed story filled with drama and pathos, and it's ripe for artistic imagination. And yet, there are virtually no images of it in Christian art before about the year 980. Scholar Barbara Bart, who has done some of the most important and significant work on this subject, calls this early period the twilight zone of the Noli Me Tangere. Why did it take almost 1,000 years for artists to take on this subject? Sorry. By the time Giotto painted his fresco on the wall of the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, in around 1305, a set of conventions had been developed, rules that dictated how the story should be depicted. Giotto's painting does in part accurately depict the text, but it also reflects pictorial conventions that had developed over centuries that were informed by later interpreters of the story. So what does the Bible actually tell us about Mary Magdalene beyond John's account? She's mentioned infrequently, but when she does appear, it's at critical moments in all four Gospels. She was among those who stayed with Jesus at the foot of the cross. She was one of the women who went to anoint his body at the tomb. She's consistently mentioned among the first witnesses to the resurrection. And she's also the one who delivered the news to the disciples. Apart from the events around Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, Luke mentions her as one of the women who had been cured of evil spirits and who provided for them out of their resources. So Mary's relationship with Jesus began with her being healed by him. And it also seems she was a woman of means, someone who could provide support to Jesus and his followers as they traveled from town to town. That's all we know about Mary Magdalene from the text. So how did she come to be understood? As a repentant sinner, or as a prostitute, or even, as was portrayed in the Da Vinci Code, the wife of Jesus and the mother of his children? Well, it all began with the early church fathers, recognizing the inconsistencies among the Gospels and also finding a conflict between Mary's encounter with Christ and Thomas's touching of his wounds just a few verses later. A conflict, by the way, that was created by these early commentators and is not present in John's Gospel. The church fathers sometimes twisted themselves into theological knots to try to explain these inconsistencies with explanations that usually, one way or the other, always seem to put the blame on Mary. The reason Jesus prohibited her from touching him was perhaps because of her incomplete faith, or her sinfulness, or simply the fact that she was a woman. In the 4th century, Ambrose of Milan compared Mary with Eve, explaining that since the first sin was committed by a woman, the first person to see the resurrected Christ will also be a woman, and that Mary's announcement to the apostles is somehow restitution for the first sin. These were all early efforts to make sense of what is going on in this passage and to explicate the answer that Jesus himself provides. Do not hold on to me because I have not yet ascended to the Father. Now, we may debate what that statement means, but nowhere in the text does Jesus question Mary's faith as he does with the other disciples, or claim that Mary's faith is insufficient, or point to her gender as a problem. On the contrary, he calls her by name, and she immediately recognizes him. And then he charges her with a crucial and, one would imagine, extremely difficult task of sharing her experience with the other disciples. With her mission as the apostle to the apostles, Mary is more than a messenger. She's the first evangelist. Still, this question of touch, which at the very least is enigmatic, was made more problematic by patristic texts, and that may be why this story was not depicted in early Christian art. More common in the first few centuries were healing stories. Sorry. Like this picture of the healing of the bleeding woman, which was painted on a Roman catacomb in the 3rd century. Many of these early images, Christ is revealed as the Savior who healed through touch. So the act of not touching could have been seen as contradictory. Of the resurrection appearances, a more common subject was the group of women at the tomb from Matthew's gospel who, when they met Jesus, took hold of his feet and worshiped him. As we see here in this engraving after a 4th century sarcophagus, you can see this grouping in the center just under the cross here, Jesus standing to the right of the cross and 2 women kneeling beneath the cross, reaching out to him. Matthew's account accomplished several things for the early church. It provided multiple witnesses to the resurrection instead of just one, and it avoided the visual problem of not touching. As a result, an iconography developed, a gestural language of women kneeling and reaching for Jesus. Now, a major turning point came in the 6th and 7th centuries when Gregory the Great preached a sermon in which he conflated Mary Magdalene and identified her for the first time as the repentant sinner who anoints Jesus' feet in the Gospel of Luke. And then later, the Venerable Bede added another Mary, Lazarus' sister, to Magdalene's identity. Ironically, this fusion of Mary Magdalene with the unnamed repentant sinner and Mary of Bethany gave Magdalene a higher profile and a greater individual identity than she'd had up to this point. It harmonized the gospel accounts with a clear story of a single personality, a penitent sinner, the sister of Martha, witness to the resurrection of Lazarus, witness to the resurrection of Jesus. With this new identity, Mary combined penitence and hope and could be faithfully venerated. The label of repentant sinner stuck. A cult of Mary Magdalene developed in the 11th and 12th centuries, and images of her began to proliferate. The first fully realized depiction that directly links text and image didn't emerge until the late 10th century in this illustration from the Gospel book of Bishop Egbert of Trier. Here we see many of the iconographic elements that became the standard template for the scene going forward. The empty tomb, the shroud, the 2 angels, the kneeling and subservient Mary Magdalene, the figure of Christ gesturing toward her and inclining away from her. He holds a book as an image of the Logos, the Word become flesh. And the tree, which has multiple functions. Compositionally, it divides the scene in half. On the left side is the death of the tomb, and on the right side is new life in the resurrection. The tree also evokes the garden where Jesus was buried, and the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And it's also associated with the cross of Christ. Each of these elements will figure in later depictions of the Noli Me Tangere. But nowhere in the Gospel of John does it say that Mary Magdalene was kneeling or that she threw herself at Jesus' feet. In fact, John describes a very dynamic encounter between Mary and Jesus, with Mary at first standing at the tomb, then turning toward Jesus twice. The first time mistaking him for the gardener, and the second time when she recognizes him as her Rabboni. But as the Noli Me Tangere imagery emerged, and the identity of Mary Magdalene began to be differentiated from the other women at the tomb, those earlier images of the women who did take hold of Jesus' feet had become set. Despite the insistence of the scriptural account, the visual imagery of the kneeling woman at the resurrection had already been collectively imprinted, and Mary Magdalene's character as a penitent sinner kneeling before Christ was fixed. There's one additional element that became a feature of this imagery, and we see it in this early gospel book belonging to Otto III, dating to around the year 1000. Here again, we see the key elements of the iconography: the tomb with the shroud, the two angels, Christ holding a book, gesturing while moving away, and Mary, while not kneeling, is in a pose of subservience and gesturing up toward Christ. Interestingly, it's paired on this page with an image of Thomas touching Christ's wounds. So again, we can see how these two stories were set up in contrast with each other. But here, there's a new psychological dimension to the encounter that's introduced through the use of eye contact. The angels look at Mary and Jesus. Jesus and Mary look at each other. And as scholar Barbara Baird has pointed out, the mutual glance signifies both love and knowledge. And it directly contradicts earlier characterizations of Mary as a person of imperfect insight and flawed faith. Here, the new Eve gains knowledge not from the tree in the garden, but from the face of Christ. In the space between Christ and Magdalene, their two hands meet without touching, reflecting each other to form a circle, a space of absence. The climactic moment of revelation is the point at which they do not touch. In his painting from 1340, Puccio di Simone positions that crucial space of absence of the two hands not touching right at the center of his composition. This is believed to be the earliest freestanding, large-scale treatment of the subject. Mary is wearing a red dress, kneeling outside a cave-like tomb. Christ moves away from her, his feet turned away, but his gaze turned back. And with his arm outstretched, his thumb almost touches her finger. Here too, in an acknowledgement of Mary's mistaking him for the gardener, Jesus is carrying a rake or a hoe, some garden tool. And the garden is more ornate. Again, an allusion to the Garden of Eden, with Jesus being the new Adam and Mary being the new Eve. A century later, the garden imagery becomes even more elaborate in Fra Angelico's painting in the convent of San Marco in Florence. And as you can see, it owes a huge debt to Puccio's earlier composition. With meticulous detail, Fra Angelico includes a profusion of different types of flowers, plants, and trees. Here again, Christ is carrying a rake or hoe, portrayed as both gardener and risen Lord, as if we're witnessing the moment of Mary's revelation. Beginning in the Renaissance, paintings of this scene have a greater emotionality, with a grief-stricken Mary flinging herself at Jesus. Renaissance artists also increasingly emphasized Christ's physical nature. Their depictions are less about Mary's humble worship of the divine presence and more about the exploration of the totality of the human experience, emotional, physical, and spiritual. They also tend to move the events back before the moment of recognition by showing Jesus as a gardener. Here he is holding a shovel, apparently having just been digging up the flower bed. A few artists during this time started to depict Mary standing, as in this Bible illustration from the Netherlands from 1538, where Mary and Jesus stand face to face, wearing contemporary attire as if they've just stopped to have a casual conversation. Printed in the Netherlands in the thick of reformist zeal, the figure of Jesus looks very much like any ordinary gardener, holding both a rake and a shovel just to drive the point home. And we would not know otherwise were it not for the glowing halo around his head. There's also this small painting by Hans Holbein from 1524, who, as you may know, was court painter to Henry VIII. Here, both Christ and Mary are fully clothed. Mary carries the alabaster jar of spices that had become her attribute by this time. The angels can be seen still seated in the light-filled tomb at the lower right. And in the background, Peter and the beloved disciple are running back to inform the other disciples that the tomb is empty. Other than the angels, who are neatly tucked away inside the tomb, this is a narrative of the story, a depiction of a very down-to-earth human encounter. So who is Mary Magdalene? Is she a penitent sinner? Is she an alluring fallen woman? Is she the apostle to the apostles? Is she all of the above? After our time together this morning, are we any closer to understanding her? One scholar summed up Mary this way: just as the Virgin Mary is the channel and conduit for the Word made flesh, so Mary Magdalene is the channel and conduit for the flesh made Word. The images we've looked at are depictions of a biblical text, but they're also reflections of centuries of commentary, the time and place in which they were created, and the people who created them. We've seen how the text, the image, the legend, and the viewer create a kind of matrix of interpretation that reveals something about each of them. Many of these images have served as sources of contemplation for me in my spiritual journey. So, as we approach the Feast of Mary Magdalene, I invite you to spend some time with these images on your own, to explore who Mary Magdalene is for you, and see where her story leads you on your own spiritual journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meredith, for showing us all these lovely images and helping lead us through a journey that involves them. I encourage those of you who have questions for Meredith to send them in. You can use the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can simply email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. We have a question already, Meredith. Someone is wondering about Noli Me Tangere, and specifically the original Greek behind it. I wonder if you know anything about the connotations of the original Greek. And I was struck even before you put up the image of Thomas touching Jesus's wounds, of the kind of comparison between Mary, who is specifically told, don't touch these wounds, and Thomas, who is invited to touch them. I found that really interesting, especially your comment that this was a comparison that the text itself doesn't invite.
but that later theologians really pressed. And I wonder to what extent that may involve gender. Thomas, the male disciple, is invited to touch, and Mary Magdalene, the female disciple, is told, "Do not touch me."
Yeah, those are both great questions. The original Greek, which I don't have in front of me, but as we often have with the New Testament, we have the original Greek and then translation into Latin, which was a much less nuanced language. The original Greek has been translated as "do not cling to me," but in fact, I think from what I've read, it doesn't mean cling, but it has different connotations in the biblical text. Do not approach me, do not get near to me. And it has been translated into the Latin and has come to us as "do not touch me." But it seems to have a more sense of a sense of keeping your distance, if you will, I think, in the original Greek. There's probably some Greek scholars out there who will better be able to discuss the Greek, but that's what the Latin is somewhat limiting to our understanding of the original Greek meaning. As for the comparison between Mary and Thomas, I find this incredibly fascinating, and it does because the stories happen just a few verses apart in Jesus's immediate post-resurrection appearances, and there's nothing in the text that would pit these two stories against each other. There's nothing in the text that points to anything about gender or Mary's gender being an issue, but I do believe that in order to figure out why these two very important and seemingly obvious contradictions in the stories, why those contradictions were there, the early fathers had to find a reason. And of course, one reason would be that Mary was a woman and that women could not touch what men may touch. And this, of course, stays with us in certain quarters still to this day. I don't think, my own personal interpretation is that these are these different resurrection appearances where people are not recognizing Jesus, where he is suddenly revealed to them. For example, on the road to Emmaus, where he is suddenly revealed to them in the breaking of the bread. These are different ways that different individuals came to know Jesus in their own way. And for Thomas, it meant he had to physically touch him. And Jesus gave him that gift. Mary's understanding and knowledge of the risen Christ happened in a different way. And the travelers on the road to Emmaus, their understanding happened in yet a different way. So to me, these are just different ways that we meet Jesus or Jesus meets us in the way that we can understand him. And for you, Peter, it may be a different way than it is for me.
Again, I invite your questions for Meredith. Please use the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. I also know that we have a live audience here at St. Bart's watching, and you can give your questions to my colleague, Manny Rodriguez-Leach, who will make sure that we get them. Our next question involves the first painting you displayed, which I believe is the De la Tour painting. And this person wonders, is the Mary Magdalene of that painting a sinner, a saint, or both?
Great question. I'm going to go ahead back to that first painting and share my screen. This is a painting that's actually, you can, if you are in New York, you can go visit it at the Met. this is again this sort of trope of the penitent Magdalene, and here she is with a very sort of the conventions of the vanitas, the mirror in which she is gazing at herself, the skull, the symbol of death, her jewelry, which is all over the table. And in fact, there, I don't know if you can see it, but at the lower right of the painting, there are bits and pieces of jewelry on the floor. So here she is as a woman of means who has given up her wealth, who has given up her worldly possessions to contemplate the meaning of the resurrection. Here she, I mean, this image, I think, has more to do with worldliness than with sexuality, although maybe it has to do with both. But she is certainly a penitent sinner who is contemplating the meaning of her life and of her encounter with Christ as it impacts her.
Meredith, you ask provocatively at the end who Mary Magdalene is for us, and you showed so many of the different ways in which she's been depicted. I wonder if you can reflect on the function of art in this tradition of this disciple. Does art obscure the reality of who Mary Magdalene is, or reveal who Mary Magdalene is, or both?
Well, that's a great question. An interesting point to note about this particular story is that many of these images were created for personal devotion. They're not, until the Puccio di Simone painting, they're for the most part small images painted either in gospel books or on small woodcuts created for personal devotional purposes. She became a person to venerate, and the cult of Mary Magdalene grew up and was very, very powerful force in personal devotion in the Middle Ages. I think that it depends on what you are, where your point of view is. If you're looking at scriptural accuracy, many of these artworks don't totally accurately reflect what the text says. But from a personal devotion standpoint, they are incredibly powerful. And they can open up a way for us to understand Mary as she relates to us, and understand that if we understand her as a repentant sinner, to whom the risen Christ appeared, that perhaps too we may also experience that. And I think these images, whether they are scripturally accurate or not, are incredibly valuable, both at the time they were created to the faithful at the time, and also for us today to use as objects of contemplation in our own personal prayers.
We have a question about whether you or the tradition has ever seen any parallels between Elijah and Elisha as Elijah is ascending into heaven, and this scene between Mary Magdalene and Jesus. I can't say I've thought of that before myself, but that is the question.
I have not seen that, and I have not in my research found any reference to that. From the point of view of intertextuality, from the point of view of how the Old Testament relates to the New Testament, the one bit of the Old Testament that has been connected to her story is the Song of Songs. And in the original Roman Missal, the Old Testament lesson for the Feast of Mary Magdalene was the Song of Songs. And there are strong parallels between the Song of Songs and the story of Mary Magdalene, which I didn't get into here, but that has been long noted by the fathers and by preachers throughout the centuries.
I wonder, as we come towards a close, although we do have time for another question or two, if our audience members want to send them in, if you can reflect on the connection between art and faith in your own life, Meredith. Art and faith have both been important parts of your life. To what extent has your experience in the art world impacted your faith, and how has your own faith impacted your understanding of art?
Well, my earliest understanding of the Bible came through art, and these images that we've been looking at that I studied in school, some of them of which I studied in school. And the more I looked at them, the more they revealed to me. And these images have, for me, been a kind of a gateway to understanding the Bible, the biblical text, and how, for example, Jesus has been portrayed throughout the centuries, the different ways that Jesus has been portrayed. And when it's not, you sort of have to spend time with the images. And one of the things that I'm able to do in the art world is spend time with images. And it's a great gift of that part of my career and my life. And it's something that I encourage everyone to do, just for the enjoyment, rather than rushing through a museum and rushing past images. When you step into a room, see which image clicks with you, see which image jumps off the wall at you, and then spend time with it. Don't move on too quickly, and see what it might reveal to you. Why was that particular image the one that you responded to? You'll see as you walk through museums around New York, around the world, the different ways that all of these familiar stories have been depicted. And you may have a particular response, positive or negative, to those images. Ask yourself what that's about. That's part of what I've gotten out of my own enjoyment and contemplation of these images is, why does this particular image resonate with me so positively? And why does this image kind of turn me off? And there are answers there that may or may not involve questions of your faith.
And it sounds like viewing artwork then can be a form of prayer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's absolutely part of my prayer life. And sometimes, when I get stuck with the words, we have a lot of words in our church. We have a lot of words in our liturgy. We have a lot of words. We do a lot of talking. Sometimes just being quiet and spending time with a favorite image is a form of prayer that is extremely restorative.
And do you think that's limited to quote unquote sacred images, or can more secular forms of artwork also help lead us to prayer?
Oh, I think absolutely secular images can lead us to prayer. One example is my particular specialty had been 19th century American landscape painting, which were done as glorifications of God's creation in a Protestant nation that rejected religious art. So they were, in a way, American religious art of the 19th century. And there are many different ways of exploring faith and our relationship with God through art. So, and it does not have to be religious imagery at all.
Well, we're approaching our end. I'm going to fit in one final question. Someone wonders, going back to the artwork featuring Mary Magdalene, the impact that benefactors may have had on the depiction of Mary Magdalene. Was this solely the artist's interpretation, or is part of what we're seeing the influence of the benefactor or benefactors on the depiction of the saint?
That's a great question. There are paintings of benefactors in the scene with Jesus and Mary. There's one that I came across that I'm afraid I don't have an image of to show you, but one would imagine that the benefactor had some input and at least putting the benefactor in the scene as sort of visualizing this, sort of depicting the benefactor, but the benefactor visualizing the scene in his mind's eye. I think that would certainly have had an impact on the artistic interpretation. And, you know, maybe there were 2 or 3 versions before the benefactor approved, who knows?
Well, Meredith, unfortunately, we have to stop there, but thank you so much for shedding some light on Mary Magdalene for us this morning as we approach her feast day, and for shedding some light on the relationship between art and faith. We're so happy to have you with us here at St. Bart's, and I look forward to hearing more about these connections in the months to come.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you all for watching. I do encourage you, if you've appreciated today's conversation or any of the conversations we've held recently, to give in support of the forum, www.stbarts.org/give. We rely on your generosity to continue to bring this series to you. And I do hope that you all will stay for worship in just a few minutes at 11 a.m. Have a great Sunday, all.